Good afternoon. Welcome to UK Column News, just after 1 o'clock on Monday, the 30th of July, 2018. Welcome to Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire, joining me in the studio today. And we're going to get straight on, Patrick, with Damien Collins, who is the chairman of the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee in the House of Commons. They have issued over the weekend a first interim report in its disinformation and fake news inquiry. Well, the first thing that they've said was that they want to stop using the term fake news. They feel that this term has achieved way too wide or broad a definition, and it's not a useful term anymore. So they want to focus on the term disinformation, which I find quite interesting because, of course, within the last 12 months, probably around August, September of last year, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office created a new role, head of counter disinformation, and so disinformation is clearly the term that they want to use, and the term that they want to get into the public mind now. And we're seeing this with this new report. Collins himself said, "We're facing nothing less than a crisis in our democracy, based on the systemic manipulation of data and to support the relentless targeting of citizens without their consent by campaigns of disinformation and messages of hate." So let's have a look at the report itself. Here it is, Disinformation and Fake News Interim Report, and we'll just run through the key points, the key recommendations. First of all, they want to make tech companies responsible and reliable, so they recommend that a new category of tech company is formulated which tightens tech companies' liabilities and which is not necessarily either a platform or a publisher. We anticipate that the government will put forward these proposals in a white paper this year. In other words, they know very well that that's what's going to happen. Now, why is this important? It's important because if we think back to 2012, when the UK column was attacked by the Authority for Television on Demand, the core aspect of the argument between us and the Authority for Television on Demand was what makes up an on-demand service, and they were attempting to suggest that the fact that we were putting videos on YouTube constituted us creating an on-demand service, when in fact it was YouTube that was supplying the on-demand service. So there was a problem of the definition in law of what on-demand meant. This takes that, broadens that issue out, because what they're saying is that the whole idea of a tech company falls in between the cracks of what is a platform and what is a publisher and the definitions, and therefore what they're saying is the law the scope of the law doesn't apply in this case. So there's going to have to be new proposals in a white paper for new law. And we've heard recently, Patrick, that Ofcom is likely to attempt to go forward with what ATVOD had tried to do in 2012 to try to regulate the production of video on demand content on the internet. This implies that this will be that's only part of a much broader initiative.
Well, it implies they're going to have to create a new entity, Mike. They're going to have to create a new government directed or sponsored entity, a new middleman. I think that's what's being hinted here. And that's normally, if you look at the behavior of government, and generally that's what government likes to do, is to create new departments, to create new strata of management. In other words, that will also create tens of thousands of jobs potentially for the bureaucracy. And so government likes that. This is good for government, is more government jobs, more bureaucracy, more regulation.
Okay, so let's run on through here. Impose a levy on tech companies to fund education and the Information Commissioner's Office. A very large part of this report is really focusing on education. And of course, we've seen a number of programs recently of organisations going into schools to teach them how to identify what's fake news and what isn't. They want to change the rules on political campaigning, and they're saying there should be a public register for political advertising, requiring all political advertising work to be listed for public display, so that even if work is not requiring regulation, it is accountable and transparent for all to see. There should be a ban on micro-targeted political advertising to Facebook lookalike audiences, where users have requested not to receive political adverts. And so it goes on. And the next one, Competition and Market Authority audit of fake accounts. And so what they're actually suggesting is that the Competition and Market Authority gets access to the social media platforms' databases to try to audit whether an account is a real account or a fake account. And they're concerned about potential defrauding of advertisers through fake accounts.
Does that include the government and the intelligence services fake accounts that they've created, of which they have hundreds and thousands of, Mike, on various social media platforms? Do those also come under the Competition and Market Authority auditing process, the intelligence services? Or are they allowed to have as many fake accounts as they want in order to troll or to sort of influence public opinion in the way that the state wants? Is that how that works?
Good question. We move on. Digital Atlantic Charter. So the UK government would consider establishing a Digital Atlantic Charter as a new mechanism to reassure users that their digital rights are guaranteed. This innovation would demonstrate the UK's commitment to protecting and supporting users and establish a formal basis for collaborating with the US on this issue. So this is something that they're very keen to do, this transatlantic collaboration, because of course many of these tech companies are US based, and so they need the cooperation of the United States authorities in order to sort of implement the proposals. So we wait and see what happens with the various white papers that come out later on. But in the meantime, Patrick, well, let's introduce people to to A.G. Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times. Now, okay, that image that's on screen at the moment from the New York Times website doesn't really it's quite small, so maybe people don't quite understand that. Actually, what age is he? About 40?
Yeah, maybe a little bit younger than that, Mike. Maybe 38 or something like that. I'm not sure, but incredibly young to be responsible for such an important global media outlet.
Absolutely. But so what's he's been saying? Well, he said he was speaking yesterday, and he said he has been warning Donald Trump during a White House meeting that Trump's attacks on the media are dangerous and harmful. And he said, I told him that although the phrase fake news is untrue and harmful, I'm far more concerned about his labeling journalists the enemy of the people. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, my thoughts are first that so there's two. There's the government wanting to distance itself from the term fake news. New York Times clearly here wanting to sort of discard and distance themselves from using this term fake news, because as we pointed out yesterday, it's boomeranged back and hit them on the head, because people are realizing the obvious truth, which is that these mainstream media outlets, including the New York Times, and the BBC, CNN, Washington Post, are the biggest purveyors historically of fake news. And so they are the problem in that sense. So in terms of this dynasty at the New York Times, Mike, they actually gutted their newsroom under this young man's management last summer during their buyout, which was really, it seemed like a purge. But who's really pulling the strings at the New York Times? Is it, I don't know if he's still the CEO, I should have checked this, but Mark Thompson.
Yeah, he is, yeah.
He's currently the CEO of the New York Times, former BBC director, who's magically left the BBC right after the Savile scandal. But anyway, he's effectively running the New York Times, so it's not run by an American, at least from the CEO position. But Sulzberger Jr. Had this. The quote is interesting with regards to Trump. So he's saying that I told the president directly that I thought his language was not just divisive but increasingly dangerous. I told him that although this term is harmful and so forth, what he's concerned about is the inflammatory language is contributing to the rise in threats against journalists and will lead to violence. Okay, let's just put this in perspective. The propaganda produced by the young Sulzberger's New York Times has caused and promoted violence against thousands, if not millions, of people in the Middle East, and as an oracle of war propaganda. Mm. That's what the New York Times is responsible for. And so you have this young man crying about the potential of journalists being targeted. Well, if anybody is upset at mainstream journalism, there's only one person that is to blame for that, and that is mainstream journalism, for being complicit to the deep state, to being complicit to the defense industry, to the war machine, and to the powers that be. That's their problem. So if they have a bad image in the view of the public, they've only themselves to blame. That goes for every single mainstream media outlet. That's what I'll say as well. The other thing that's interesting, Mike, is they fired their public editor, their internal ombudsman last year. And Sulzberger said, well, we had to do this to free up the budget for more reporters. So we're firing quite a few of our editors. But we're going to make up for this, he says, by opening up the comment section on the New York Times. That was promised last summer. They only had about 10% of their articles open to comments. So as we said yesterday, Mike, these mainstream media outlets can't accept readers' comments because the readers are making coherent arguments that are basically debunking or discrediting the fake news that newspapers like the New York Times and the Guardian are doing on a daily basis. So have they actually opened up their articles to comments as was promised last summer by Mr. Sulzberger Jr.? I'm not sure if that's the case, Mike. I'm not sure if that's the case. Is that a case of just putting out this PR to keep the dogs off in light of this purge that he was overseeing last summer? So the New York Times has a lot to answer for, Mike.
This issue of purging the experienced journalists, this is something that British media has experienced in the last few years as well. The Telegraph certainly has. Most of them have. We'll be coming on to the results, Trinity Mirror in a minute, the financial results, which aren't too good. But we have been left in the situation where people at editor level or sub-editor level have been gotten rid of. They've got journalists, in inverted commas, aged between 23 and 30 that have no real experience. That are, worse than that, are expected to write up to 10 articles a day. Mm-hmm.
Copying and pasting them off the
They have no
wire.
choice.
Yeah.
What choice do they have? So you know, how this becomes an ever descending spiral, doesn't it? Because they get bad financial results. They cut their staff. That lowers the quality of the journalism that's done. People turn off to what they're producing, so they get worse results, and then they cut more staff. And there's only one outcome for this, isn't there?
Well, the establishment still need these media outlets to control and to put out a narrative that the state or that the establishment or the intelligence agencies want put out. And by the way, that's just a fact, and that's well documented.
Yes. So let's look at what Donald Trump's response to this report was. The failing New York Times and the Amazon Washington Post do nothing but write bad stories, even on very positive achievements, and this is a fair point. He also accused them of being unpatriotic, well, they've got a problem in the United States because the US government, certainly under Trump, isn't going to come riding to the rescue. In the UK, it's not quite the same story because when Matthew Hancock was Secretary of State until recently of the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, he made it clear that the UK government's intention is to shore up the failing press and media in this country, the mainstream press and media in some way, which may even include government funding, broadening out the funding of media, not just to the BBC, but to other mainstream platforms as well.
And that's the Scandinavian model, which is government-funded media, government-funded independent media, in other words. That's the Scandinavian model.
Well, you've got to ask how far the word independence reaches under those circumstances.
It doesn't reach very far, unfortunately.
No. Okay, well, sticking with this subject, here is Reuters, and the headline is Facebook suspends UK conspiracy theorist Alex Jones.
Well, look, as soon as I posted this on my Facebook page, Alex Jones is a magnet for controversy and comments, and the comments just started pouring in, Mike, literally within a minute. The comment thread, it's already, I don't know how high it is now, but I just put this out this morning on my Facebook page. So, look, we are very critical of InfoWars and Alex Jones exaggerating, pumping up clickbait, Islamophobia, complete end-of-the-world fear-mongering on a pretty much a weekly basis. This is standard fare if you follow this news outlet. But in this sense, Facebook is showing its fascist face, because whether you like Alex Jones or not, the fact of the matter is that if you're going to allow a corporation or Facebook, who's highly politicized, to decide who gets to be heard and who is going to be not allowed to be heard, who's going to be shut up, then we have a much bigger problem than the so-called crisis of fake news. That's the point here. I think we also made that same point, Mike, in our interview yesterday with Renan Santos. And he has a lot of detractors. They're very controversial. The Free Brazil movement, they've been accused of many things. Right-wing group funded by the U.S. establishment and so forth. But at the end of the day, this is a political group, one of many political groups that's being censored by Facebook. And not just in Brazil, globally, Mike, left-wing groups in Pakistan being pulled down by Facebook in collusion with the Pakistani government. Here in Brazil, in collusion with the Brazilian government, pulling down right-wing groups. In the UK, there's pressure from certain establishment oracles to take Jeremy Corbyn's Facebook presence down because of anti-Semitism. He's left-wing. So in the United States, they're trying to take shadow ban right-wing conservative groups. So the point we made, Mike, I think is very consistent with the findings in these news stories, which is it doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you identify with, use that word identity. The point is, Facebook doesn't care internationally. Facebook might be a democratic leaning organization in the United States, but internationally, Facebook goes with what the power allows it to go with, because Facebook wants to have access to all markets internationally. So to operate in different countries, they have to play ball with whatever the government or whatever the power structure is in that individual country. So Facebook will plunge a knife in the back of any political group and do whatever any government says to do, so long as they're allowed to make their money and have their user base and their market share. That's all Facebook cares about. They don't care about ethics, morals, or any of those nice things. Facebook is in it to make money and to have as big of a presence in the market as possible, because that pumps up their share price in the Ponzi scheme called the stock market. So it's not a partisan issue, Mike. It's not a left, it's not a right issue. It's a relative issue depending on what country you're in. It's an issue about power and censorship and being allowed to pick winners and losers. That's the problem with Facebook.
One other comment to add to that, Patrick, of course, is that Zuckerberg now has his foundation, and that foundation is funded from the stock price of Facebook, and that foundation is being used through the whole NGO civil society operation in very many countries to push the change agenda. So Facebook has another reason for maintaining a high stock price, and that is because the powers that be, that want to promote social change through the civil society movements, the NGOs and so on, are using that money to do that, and so that's something that they need.
So the establishment have co-opted Zuckerberg to, like Bill Gates, like Pierre Oudemire, and like, of course, George Soros, in order to create these massive NGO civil society industrial complexes that they can use as change agents globally. They are instruments of the establishment.
Well, a related issue, of course, is intimidation in public life, because the disinformation and so-called fake news that the government is talking about is blamed on the murder of, or at least the murder of Joe Cox is blamed on that, and other events that are going on. Well, the government has now launched a consultation yesterday for a new electoral offence, which aims to crack down on threats and abuse towards anybody standing for election. The consultation is going to run until the end of October, I think 22nd of October, and they're looking on views on clarifying the electoral offence of undue influence of voters. Currently, a person is guilty of undue influence if they threaten electors to vote a certain way or stop them from voting. But they're also looking at bringing in legislation to make it a criminal offence to intimidate, either physically or in person or online, to intimidate somebody who's standing for election. So
where do you draw the line on that?
This is the question. Now, at this point, this is a consultation, and maybe there's opportunity for people to get involved in a discussion about it. But where do you draw the line on that? And at what point does a reasonable question on Twitter become harassment? And we have seen harassment, the term harassment, being used as an excuse for MPs to stop communicating with their constituents when they're being asked difficult questions, and in fact for MPs to involve the police with constituents when they're being asked difficult questions. And this seems to be related to the idea of a fixated threat, for example. And this is a pretty dangerous direction to go in.
So the arbitrary interpretation of this, Mike, could create a nice layer of protection for a corrupt politician should they not want any questions about anything that they've done or involvement in any scandals or anything like that. So that's, I think, the real danger here.
Absolutely. Okay, so this is Reach. Reach is the new name for Trinity Mirror Group because they bought up the Express Group recently. So they now are responsible for the Mirror, the Express, the Daily Star, and so on. And unfortunately, they have released their half-year report and have lost £113.5 million, Patrick, in the first half of 2018.
As you do.
And that's apparently despite revenue growth.
Interesting.
So there you go. That's pretty unfortunate. We'll just put that on. £113.5 million lost. As I say, Reach was formerly known as Trinity Mirror. And these are adjusted results because they have apparently put some money into a particular project, which they've had to therefore write down certain profits. So somehow profits become a loss, but there you go.
Right, reaching for the beggar's tin.
Reach's net debt has increased from £72 million to £81 million during that period. So, well,
I'm sure the directors are making good money, though. Or the, what do you think?
Well, it's quite possible, but of course, who's the loser on this? Well, of course, the public's the loser because what happens is that we don't get a proper fourth estate, and also we don't get any proper standard of journalism. This is what we've been discussing so far.
This opens the door also, Mike. This sort of balance sheet opens the door for a aggressive raider or a bank to come in or somebody to buy up the whole lot for $1. Restructure the debt, and like a Jeff Bezos, for instance, somebody who's got 100 million, a couple $100 million's a bit of spare cash. They could clear the balance sheet off in a week, but buy it for $1, basically. So that's dangerous in itself.
Now, if anybody thinks we've been unfair on the profession of journalism, we'll just leave this subject before we move on with Lise Doucette, who has a different view on what it means to be a journalist.
Without kindness, where would we be? Journalism is a profession which depends on kindness. The kindness of strangers who open their hearts and their homes to us. The kindness of people who have lost almost everything and still kindly say, please come in, have a cup of tea, please share our last meal. The kindness of people who in their hour, their moment of grief will say, sit down, I'll tell you my story. Without kindness, there'd be no storytelling. And without kindness, I wouldn't be here.
Now, Lise Doucette, of course, BBC Foreign Affairs correspondent, but clearly we're not journalists, Patrick, because we haven't been kind to the mainstream media this morning.
No, what this is part of a sort of industry-wide, across all the mainstream media. They're trying to rehabilitate their image as sort of trusted sources of news and showing the human side of the propaganda machine, trying to get people on side with these organizations. So they're putting out personalities as well. They're putting out a lot of sloganeering, like the Washington Post, democracy dies in the darkness, please support our great organization. And the Guardian has their sort of tip jar there and their plea at the end of every article, which is long and really long in the tooth. So this is part of the rehabilitation of the mainstream media, Mike, because as we said, that boomerang from the fake news attack that they launched out into the public and the alternative independent sphere has come back to whack them on the head. So they'll continue to do these wonderful little fluff pieces. We're looking forward to them.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, well, let's move on. Now, the report into MH370 was released today. Now, of course, this is the Malaysia Airlines jet, which vanished in March 2014 with 239 people on board, mostly from China. It was traveling from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. There's been no sign of it since. It has just magically disappeared into nothingness, despite a search of 120,000 square kilometers. Was that 46,000 square miles of Indian Ocean? And of course, that search led by the Australians. So family members were given the official investigation team's report this morning, and then they were briefed by Kok Soo Chon, who's head of the safety investigation team. They said that it was quite possible that the disappearance of MH370 was caused by unlawful interference, and they came to that conclusion based on findings that show that the pilot and his first officer had no history of mental illness, and so they're dismissing the suggestion that the pilots deliberately crashed the aircraft, and that the aircraft was unexpectedly rerouted back towards Malaysia and flown manually, not an autopilot. But they said that the possibility of unlawful interference was not really very certain, so they don't really know either way. And this is partly because, of course, nobody has actually claimed any responsibility for any kind of shoot down or whatever, or hijack. So Mr. Cox said, this doesn't mean that the issue is resolved forever. The wreckage has not been found. He said the passengers have not been found. How can we call our report a final report? There must be some form of closure. So this was the final report, but even the person that wrote the report is saying it's not the final report. So, Patrick, what are your thoughts on this?
Look, we can deconstruct this. Firstly, look at their findings. They're saying that there was no autopilot, that this plane was rerouted manually. Okay, and so that is, I'm going to translate that, is to cancel out any possibility of any discussion about the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot, which we reported on. This is a great report. It's probably the best report on the internet on this Boeing uninterruptible autopilot system. This was a great research project by Sean Helton at 21st Century Wire. We'll probably provide links to these articles, by the way, Mike, under this video today on the news. We'll give this to your producer and make sure they do that. But if you look at this article, this is an absolute real piece of technology. This is standard on most modern aircraft, and it does allow for the remote hijacking, let's say, from the authorities of any plane that has this system fitted, which is most planes. So the fact that they're ruling this out means that you should be looking at this possibility, because they're not providing any explanation. They're basically saying, you can't follow any possibility of any permutation of a possibility of what happened. You just have to sort of say, oh my God, we don't know what happened. So the second thing is that they cannot rule out unlawful interference. So they're drifting out the possibility that a third party, and if you're from America or the UK, or you're in the hysterical anti-Russian world right now, take a wild guess of who they're hinting at there. So this is a dog whistle, I think, to the anti-Russian hysterical mob. But from a Malaysian point of view, Mike, though, the Malaysians, a lot of Malaysians have maintained that there is some meddling going on this issue, and it's not from Russia or China, but from the West, okay? And they're also saying this wasn't a suicide mission, that the pilot had no mental illness. They spent weeks destroying the character of this pilot, dragging him through all these different wild fake news conspiracy theories on CNN, okay? They did this post-mortem that was just out to defame this pilot and plant the seed that he was mentally unhinged, and that he ditched this plane because he was crazy. Okay, the whole of the media was on board with that fake news narrative. And now all of a sudden, this report saying that no, that wasn't the case. So everything is pointing, Mike, at remote, some sort of remote hijacking of the plane, even though this denied in this report. But if you go back to the article I wrote in 2014, right here, right after MH17. Now, I got accused of being a conspiracy theorist and all sorts of things. It turns out I was correct. Go back to 2014, and how this wild goose chase in the Indian Ocean, in the South Indian Ocean, why would they divert all of these assets, Royal Navies and so forth, to go waste time trawling through the South Indian Ocean, Mike? It was a British firm called Inmarsat, the Inmarsat, satellite communications firm, that came up with reports of debris sightings right after the disappearance of MH17, and they sent that to the UK Air Accident Investigative Branch in Aldershot, who sprung into action, and they managed to somehow take they had data. They claimed they had data from planes to satellites, and they used this data in that relay, part of Inmarsat's array of 30 satellites, which overlaps with Raytheon, by the way, in the same operation. They claim that they have all this data. Well, if they have data between the satellites and the plane that supposedly is saying it was in the Indian Ocean, which this report says it wasn't, and clearly it probably wasn't, because they turned the Indian Ocean upside down after millions of dollars and who knows what assets. So wouldn't they not have the exact location, or at least the route of the plane, confirmed through the satellite data that Inmarsat claims it has? So this was all, the wild goose chase was prompted by a British firm. It's a very well connected, there's connections to the Carlyle Group, there's all sorts of interesting connections. That's all in the article, which I published in 2014. And so that's part of the mainstream media fake narrative, the wild goose chase between big media and big defense contractors created a whole diversion in the wake of MH370. That's a fact, and it's been more or less confirmed by this latest report. So Mike, make of what you want about this latest report. There's some good points in there, there's some diversions in there, but really it kind of vindicates most of, directly and indirectly vindicates a lot of what we said early on.
Okay, moving on. Jeremy Hunt is in China today, and well, he began very well. He was sitting down for breakfast at a round table with the Chinese top diplomats, and he began by explaining that he has a Japanese wife. Oh, actually, I mean, I've got a Chinese wife. So he wasn't entirely certain what kind of wife he had. And of course, suggesting that he had a Japanese wife to a Chinese diplomat isn't necessarily a term isn't going to endear him to them, because of course the Chinese don't like the Japanese very much at all. But you know, he's delighted about what's going on in China, because the Chinese have said they're ready to open discussions on possible free trade deal once the UK leaves the EU. So that they've signed major new commercial deals worth over £9 billion. Apparently, new measures to improve market access to China and remove barriers to trade. They've agreed to open up the Chinese market to enable UK financial services expertise to reach more Chinese consumers. I have to say that if that's any more than the Chinese doing lip service to the City of London, honestly, that would be a big mistake by the Chinese. But anyway, and they're going to hold extensive discussions during the course of the day on the importance of multiculturalism and free trade, how UK and China can work together on global challenges like climate change, security, non-proliferation, and enforcing United Nations sanctions on North Korea. So Britain goes into China with the same old geopolitical rhetoric.
Lucky his wife's not Korean as well.
Well, I mean, she could be, because, I mean, maybe that was the next sentence, but that bit wasn't reported. But the Chinese have made it clear that they are not interested in Britain attempting to interfere in Hong Kong, because, of course, Britain likes to put pressure on China over how people in Hong Kong, or particularly people in Hong Kong that are campaigning against the Chinese government. Right, so
I don't think Britain should complain after all the gold that was left in the vaults okay.
Yeah, okay. So anyway, Wang Yi said, who's a senior Chinese diplomat, he said today that the affairs of Hong Kong are the domestic affairs of China, and really Jeremy Hunt should just butt out on that issue. It is, and so he should, is really all we say. Let's move on to the Middle East and to Peter Hitchens. Quite a spectacular report, the blog that he's posted over the weekend, Patrick, on the Daily Mail, and asking the question about the white helmets. Are they really heroes, or are they more fanatics? He said You may recall the fuss that Theresa May made about getting rid of the Islamist preacher Abu Qatada, 11 years of legal wranglings and so on. And he said, well, why then is the British government seriously considering welcoming into this country an unknown number of men who have been closely associated for several years with an armed faction linked to Al-Qaeda, or with others perhaps even worse? And then he goes on to describe what's been going on around this story. I do recommend people read this blog post. He ends up by saying the Foreign Office tells me that the Home Office, not the Foreign Office, will be vetting those chosen to come here. I hope they'll be careful when they do so. I'm sure that the future Home Secretaries will not be grateful if any of the new arrivals turns out to have the same opinions as Abu Qatada. In any case, it's time the British government came clean about who it has been helping in Syria. And that's absolutely true.
Well, keep this up here. I just want to comment what Peter Hitchens is saying here is most welcome. But I'm going to add to Peter Hitchens and say that the ideology adopted and held by members of the White Helmets is much more extreme than Abu Qatada, because they are battle-hardened in some cases, also moonlighting as al-Nusra fighters or Noor al-Dinzinki. These are people who have carried out actual atrocities and not just waxing polemic from Finsbury Park or wherever. Okay, so these are really hardcore, violent, and exclusively male, exclusively Sunni and Salafi, or leaning more towards the Wahhabi spectrum of Islam. Okay, fundamentalist. There are no Christians in the White Helmets. There are no Shiite Muslims in the White Helmets. It is a sectarian, extremist, ideological, exclusive membership, okay? And all of the government ministers are in total denial of this. Most of them are clueless. They just go with the flow and go with, you know, whatever the Guardian's going with, the safe route on that. And they're all in denial of the fact and the reality that White Helmets have been working hand in hand with some of the worst extremists on the planet for the last 5 years. That's a fact. You can go and check it out for yourself, or you can just deny that it's happening and continue and wait for something maybe bad to happen, which is what Peter Hitchens is alluding to.
One of the questions that he asks in the blog is something that we've been talking about since this story broke in the first place. He said, as far as I can discover, other defeated groups of Syrian rebels and their hangers-on have been bussed under safe conducts to the rebel-held north of Syria under Turkish and Russian supervision. Why not this time? What was the risk? What were they so worried about? And he was talking about them being brought out of Syria through Israel so rapidly. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? What was the risk? Or were they concerned about perhaps Western media speaking to these people? Perhaps were they concerned about information coming out through interrogation and so on?
Absolutely. Look, Mike, you're absolutely correct. The White Helmets are not a Syrian organization. Okay, the White Helmets are funded by the UK, the US government, the Dutch government, the German government, various other states that have chipped in order to launder the guilt of if there's any future involvement and create some sort of blurry cloud of deniability that nobody in one country is responsible. But the fact is they're Western created, Western funded, and so it's a huge risk for the sponsors of the White Helmets to have any of these people ever talking to the media about some of the antics that have already actually been exposed in some cases. It would be hugely embarrassing and would collapse the entire narrative and this facade that they've built in Hollywood, this basic house of cards, this public relations house of cards. It's no different than the house of cards that's been created for little Bana of Aleppo or whoever the next local person they're using for geopolitical ends. Is the White Helmets are not only that, Mike, but if you look at the numbers, a lot of the people who have been taken out in this Operation Paperclip type exfiltration are terrorists by other reports as well. It's not just White Helmets. There's not that many White Helmets rescuers running around. That's also part of the lie that there's thousands of rescuers all working diligently in Syria, and they saved 115,000 lives over the last 5 years. That's a lie in itself. There's no way they can prove that. They never will be able to prove that. It's just a figure, a big figure that's been plucked out of thin air. It's the same big figure that our politicians mindlessly, brainlessly keep parroting, which is that Assad has killed 500,000 of his own people. That technically, by the facts, by the numbers, is a lie. But yet it's repeated by politicians. So we have a problem in our political class with fake news. Politicians seem to be addicted to fake news, whether it's Assad's killed 500,000 of his own people, or the white helmets have saved 115,000 lives somehow. That's an average of saving about 100 a day. Syria didn't fly that many air sorties in order to have them rescue 100 a day on average for 5 years. Syria and Russia combined, not even close. Provide us with locations, let's see, accident reports. Is there one interview with a survivor, one of these 115,000 people they've saved? Nothing. All we have is helmet cams, heavy breathing, and people passing babies to one another. And it gets wired straight to CNN in minutes. That's all we get with the white helmets.
Okay, well, let's move on to the policy exchange, a slightly related issue here, because they are proposing a border audit. This is a new paper, a new report from the Policy Exchange. Well, they're saying what? That really the issue here is Brexit and what's going to happen with EU migrants that are in this country. And they're saying, well, the government has already announced that the EU citizens that are living in the UK are going to have to register with the new system. They're going to have to pay £69 or something like that to get their new papers in order to have a right to stay. Really, this should probably be seen as some kind of embryonic ID scheme and should be rolled out initially voluntarily to the rest of the UK, to UK citizens. But ultimately not. It would be something which would be mandatory. And what, Patrick, I found pretty staggering was that once again today, I started seeing people on the political right of the discussion saying that this is a fantastic idea. What with all these Islamic immigrants that we've got coming into the country at the moment, this is exactly what we need. And I find this quite staggering because this is a fundamental reversal of the basic rights of British subjects in that in this country, contrary to the rest of Europe, there is a presumption of innocence. And what that means is that if you're stopped by the police, there is no requirement to identify yourself. The police are quite at liberty to arrest you if they think that you've committed a crime. But you're not required to identify yourself in this country because of the presumption of innocence. Frankly, the idea of ID cards, the idea of having a mandatory requirement to identify yourself and having papers that you have to present to the authorities if they stop you in the street, is something which has been fought against since before the Second World War, really, but certainly following the Second World War. And I'm staggered that people that otherwise would be campaigning to uphold constitutional rights in this country are, because of the issue of Islamic immigration, prepared to throw them away. And it's not just in this area. We've been commenting on other areas of the Constitution which they seem to be equally willing to throw away because of this issue as well. And it seems nuts to me.
Yeah, so you have the Brexiteers cheering for the police state matrix. As long as it's for the Muslims, then it's all going to be fine. They wouldn't do that to us white Anglo-Saxons, flying the cross of St. George and whatnot. That's not going to happen to us. But as long as it's for the Muslims, it's okay. But I got a news flash for you. Once you implement this system, it's for everybody. So you either know your constitutional rights or you don't. Period. So think about why you voted for Brexit in the first place. Is my question.
Right. Well, we'll end on this one. Patrick, absolutely spectacular. Barnet Council begins a discussion about stripping Jeremy Corbyn of his allotment over Labour Party anti-Semitism. Now, for our foreign viewers and listeners, an allotment is a piece of land which is given to people. You normally have to join a pretty long waiting list to get hold of one, where if you don't have a garden in your attached to your property, you're entitled to go and grow whatever fruit, vegetables, flowers, whatever it is you want to grow on this piece of land that you're given. So Barnet Council wanting to remove Corbyn's allotment. This is rather pathetic, isn't it?
Yeah, this is as if Jeremy Corbyn is the reincarnation of Alf Garnett or something. This anti-Semitic trope is just out of control. So now they want to strip poor Corbyn of his allotment. I love the title of this website, Mike. Though this takes the biscuit in terms of URLs. I think it's antisemitism.uk. So they're really going straight to the point there. But as we talked about on the show, Mike, yesterday, this is out of control. You're going to see more of this being pushed out. People are going to get absolutely sick of it if they're not already. And this is to debilitate and to sort of take the legs out from under the Labour Party, and specifically any Jeremy Corbyn leadership run for perhaps maybe a snap election, Mike, in the coming months. So this is a coordinated campaign by the establishment. Who's running point on this in the mainstream media is the Times, the Rupert Murdoch Times, and then the Israeli lobby is also working in, it seems, Mike, say if I'm wrong, but seems to be working hand in hand with the Conservative Party. They're not protesting any of this. So what are we looking at here, Mike? Is this not a conspiracy?
It seems to be some kind of conspiracy which is cross-party. It's the Blairites and the Tories seem to be working together on this.
Right, the Blairites, the Tories, and the mainstream media and the establishment. So, yeah, they don't want to see a Jeremy Corbyn leadership run.
Okay, we're completely out of time. Thank you very much for joining us today, Patrick. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow, 1 p.m. as usual, and Brian will be back in the studio, so we hope to see you then. Bye-bye.